Eating breakfast already, huh?
So, how are you?
Oh, okay for the shape I'm in.
Okay. Get that glitching fixed?
I had it fixed, and this morning it was working fine, but I noticed right now it's glitching again. It was working smoothly. Both cameras. I don't know what it is.
What's your power source? You got plugged right into the wall, or you've got got one of those battery operated one that's got a battery on it?
Well, we don't have one that has a battery on it. Well, that's not true. I guess it does have a battery built in. Nothing detachable.
So the power goes off, it still will throw power at it?
Right, just for a moment. Just long enough to shut down.
Okay. Well, you got your power filter. Equipment works from time to time, so it's got to be in logic says it's got to be in your feed from the internet. Are you too far away still? Time to time?
It's direct wired, so I don't think that should be an issue.
It's a timing issue of some sort.
Yeah, I mean it could be an issue.
The
I mean,
only thing that I can think of is maybe you're still too far away from it.
that could be an issue. You know, you do lose. You know, just like with electricity, you do lose signal for every
Right.
distance that you go. But the problem is,
And how old is your wire?
part of it is old. Part of it is relatively new, like within a year.
Do you have it patched?
I have it coupled.
Is it outdoor rated wire? I know you're running it outdoors.
Yeah, that I don't know. I don't. Probably not. Not.
Well, if your old wire and your coupling is not.
But the problem is, Chuck.
Compatible.
The problem is, Chuck. Even if I'm disconnected from the internet, the program itself is where the glitching happens. Like I can be disconnected from the internet and still see that glitching on the program. Now it may be something electrical like you talked about before, feeding through the electrical outlet. That's my last best guess.
That might be a grounding issue.
Yeah.
You've got a ground. Yeah.
Well, there's no ground on this building, but it is connected back to the house that is grounded.
There's grounded.
We didn't ground this, sir. We put this panel in.
Yeah, and I drove that 8-foot rod into the ground.
You did?
Yeah.
Oh. I don't remember that. Okay. It is grounded.
He's the one that pounded it in, that's why you remember.
Right. Anyhow, it's just strange that it will work and then sometimes it does this glitching. I don't understand it. I wonder if maybe I should just, when I get done with church each Sunday, just unplug it, just shut everything down, unplug it, let it sit, let everything just reset instead of letting it be in standby mode. That's what I wonder. But I'll try that this week and see what happens.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to finish up going through the review of what happened at convention. Last week we talked about the two very important issues. One is how we're proceeding in regards to the discussions with the Wisconsin Synod and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod. And the Board of Doctrine and the Joint Committee put forward the those 3 points that we want those two church bodies to consider, and if they are not willing to consider them, then that would be the end of the discussions. If they are willing to consider them, and by consider, it means more than just say, okay, yeah, let's talk about them. It means actually agree that those things need to be done. Those 3 points, again, are all 3 church bodies have to clearly state what Romans 16:17 teaches. All 3 church bodies, well, 2 is the Wells and ELS have to reject the false doctrine from their historical statements. And 3, they have to actually correct the statements that they have in their official publications, not just put an annotation next to them and say, well, what they're doing now is just saying, this statement is fine, it can be understood correctly, even though it's really wrong, false. And they're putting an asterisk by it, and the asterisk says, for a fuller explanation, look at this document, which is the joint statement that occurred a few years back. So that's how we're proceeding with that. The missions is, Board of Missions was directed to change their guidelines to encourage Christian day schools and mission congregations when feasible, and that when feasible is awfully subjective. Lots of gray area, right? As I mentioned last week, one of the board of doctrine members said, yeah, because it says when feasible, that means, doesn't matter, we can put this in, we're still gonna approach it the same way now. Because when feasible means we don't ever think it's feasible. So, there was a memorial to create a new board of education. Instead of doing that, what convention decided to do, because we do have a board of education and publication, what they decided to do is establish a committee under that board that is responsible, and that's called the Committee for Domestic Christian Day Schools. And then a fund was established because there's no line item budget for that committee or for the Board of Education to help start schools. They established a fund called the Fund for Christian Education. And then the Board of Education and Publication is supposed to bring a proposal for continued implementation and ongoing funding of a program to establish new Christian day schools and provide support and encouragement. They already provide support and encouragement, that's why they're the Board of Education and Publication. But now they're supposed to actually help with funding, not just provide material. Okay, so that's that. Any questions on any of that? All right, well, going forward, Emmanuel Lutheran College, we have several resolves there. Resolve that we encourage the Board of Regents to research and complete improving the Wi-Fi on campus using existing resources. In other words, we're not giving you any more money, but we want this at the top of the list of things that you're spending money on. I don't know how bad the Wi-Fi is there. Was it bad? You don't know either. Yeah, our kids had data on their phone, so they didn't have that issue. But I know when I'm there at convention, I never have a problem logging on. Do you? Mark?
I really didn't do anything except vote.
Yeah, maybe in the dorms it's worse.
You can get Wi-Fi in
Huh?
the gym. You can get Wi-Fi in
Yeah, in the gym.
Then they must turn a special one on for you, because we don't even have, there's not even Wi-Fi to be had in the gym.
Yeah, when we were at.
Well, then how do
games,
they
yes.
stream games?
I don't know. You can't get it on your phone at least.
They have it direct wired? Oh,
Or they have the guest Wi-Fi, that's what it is. Because the guest Wi-Fi.
okay. Well, I know when I'm at convention or pastoral conference, I never have an issue.
And I use my laptop. not this convention, but the last time I was up there, when I was in the dorm.
You didn't have a problem?
No.
Well, you know what it is, I think, and because they have such a strict firewall when the students are there. The students each have, in order to access the internet, each student has to give their IP address of whatever device they're using. And that to Ross, and then Ross puts it in so that that computer can now actually access the internet. But the firewall is so strict that, and I mean, I understand that it's strict, that it needs to be strict, but it's so strict that, I mean, try it at your own home computer one time. Put it at maximum security for inappropriate websites, and find out how many websites you can actually access. It won't be many. You know, if you are accustomed to accessing news, for example, if you have it set on the strictest setting, there will be a lot of news channels you can't access. So that might be part of the problem, but I don't know about the strength of signal because I just have never had an issue with that. Anyhow, so that's one resolution. The next one is we approved the Emmanuel Lutheran College Planning Committee design concept and plan to construct a new gymnasium and center for fine arts building. I thought it was called the Fine Arts / Chapel, but that's changed here. So, and just to recap on that, the estimated cost of that, if we were to start in 2025, is $20 million. The building fund has been established. There's about $1 million in it. We can't proceed with the building program according to convention. Well, I mentioned this last week too. That's the second resolve from the bottom underneath this section. No, that's not it. Boy, they didn't even include it. The one that actually tells us when we can do it. So we're gonna borrow $3 million from the CEF at an interest rate of 2.5%, which means we have to have $17 million on hand before building can begin. Now, and of course, every year after 2025, the price is going to go up even more. So, which further makes it unlikely at this rate that we will get there, I think. They are going to be looking into the feasibility of selling the 10 or so acres that are on the other, I think that was the right amount, 10 acres, Mark, or was it 15?
I'm not sure what it is.
Yeah. Certain number of acres on the other side of the creek that we aren't able to use. And neither is anybody else because much of it is, like this property, is in floodplain.
I thought they already sold the beyond the creek.
I thought they had too, but they didn't. They still have.
What?
I thought they sold the land beyond the creek.
I remember we talked about it a number of years ago, well, back when we were doing the academic center, they brought it up. I thought that had been sold, but apparently not.
Yeah, that was brought up a couple times, I think it's been brought up.
Yeah.
And it was brought up at the same time with that little corner of property that was right there when you come onto campus across from the parking lot now. That one little spot that
Oh, yeah.
somebody else was using was really ours.
Right. The Corden.
Came up at that same time there.
Yep. Okay, so, so much for Emmanuel Lutheran College. Now we go to financing. Well, here you see our total overall budget there in the bold, $2,065,960. but a sizable portion of that comes from IOC revenue, from the student portion of what it costs to attend IOC. So that's $765,000 that is being paid into the CLC essentially by paying room and board and tuition for IOC. So the offerings, they're anticipating being $1.279 million to the CLC. So that is what we call missions offerings, or the CBP offerings. Still haven't heard where we ended our fiscal year. It was mentioned prior to convention that we were down 181,000 from this last budget. We did have a reserve fund, but we were the last 2 years we were also lower on income than we were on budget. Not lower on. Now here's an important distinction. Our expenses were actually less than budgeted too, but not as much as what we were less in offerings. And part of that, has to do with the COVID pandemic. Significant number of people. Well, there was a significant reduction in attendance at church throughout the CLC, so that led to a significant reduction of offerings. It is concluded anyways. Now for this first resolved here under finances, for the last, I think it's been about 15 years, the way we've been approaching the salaries of our called workers has been an automatic cost of living increase to keep up with inflation, but then also another increase to actually try and bring the base level of what the salary is up as well. This year, well, actually a couple years ago, someone brought up the question, how long are we going to continue to increase the called worker salaries this way? Is there not a goal? Is there not a stopping point? Which is a valid question. I mean, if we keep going the way we were going, maybe it'd be $5,000 a month one day. Well, obviously, that's not necessary. So the question was, do we need to continue that? Well, they put a committee together to research what they thought should be the average, what the average income of the CLC is, of CLC members is, and they thought that would be a fair spot to have the called workers at, the average. And their conclusion is, from where the base is right now, it actually needs to increase another 300,000, but because of budget constraints, they said we're not able to implement that this year. But they also recognized that, our convention recognized that due to the inflation, we don't want our called workers to actually go backwards either. So they set a cost of living increase at 8% for this next year. So it actually comes out to be about the same increase as it would normally be when it was only adjusted for inflation plus another increase. So I think it's roughly $148 increase from the base for next year. But the compensation committee still believes another $300 per month needs to be added on to that base at some point in the future. We had this CLC foundation and endowment. That is where offerings would go, special offerings would go that were not designated. They would end up in this CLC foundation endowment. But for the past several years, nothing has been happening that way. Usually offerings that come in end up in a designated fund, like the one that came in that paid off the mortgage on the AC, and is now actually also going toward the next building program. So since the CLC Foundation was, there was nothing to do with it, they decided to take the money in the foundation and put it into the general fund endowment. And understand what the difference between an endowment and the fund is. You have the general fund, and money, all that money gets spent. But in an endowment, you don't spend the money, you only spend the interest. So as the endowment grows, it obviously produces more interest. So, so the money from the endowment went into the general fund endowment. Then the question is what to do with the money in the actual foundation. So there's an endowment and there's a foundation. The endowment went into the general fund endowment. Now what to do with the foundation money? Well, that was only about $5,000. Well, we had considerable discussion on that, didn't we, Mark?
Yep.
What to do with that? And, well, you remember, we started a special fund for the Christian day schools, but we didn't put any money in it. So, on the last day of convention, we decided to take 4,000 of that 5,000 and put it into that fund for Christian education. And the rest of it went into just the general fund, the rest of that 5,000.
Is there any way to, his feet?
Oh, is he getting feedback?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just turn off the volume.
You okay?
Yeah, we're getting a little bit of feedback. So I'm just gonna turn my volume down. Maybe I'm not.
Do you want us to watch on YouTube?
No, that's okay. I'm just gonna turn it down a little bit. That's better. You can still hear me though, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So on the top of the last page, convention also resolved that the Board of Trustees report to the 2024 convention on a timetable for achieving the new target base in compensation. So right now, the base is, I forget the exact amount, I think it's like 27. And then there's an increase for your number of years of experience. I think it's $6.50 per month for every year up to 15 years. So that's how it's calculated. And then, of course, also the number of children that the called worker has, which is $40 a month per child. But the new base, I think, was 31 something. So the new target base, not the new base. Budgeting process. Okay, about 15 years ago, we established a budgeting process that actually pertains especially to ILC, that they get an automatic percent increase to their budget, and then they have to make everything fit. Well, and looking back, it's never worked out that way. Sometimes that automatic increase was too much for ILC. Sometimes it wasn't enough. So they went back to a traditional way of establishing the budget, which is tell us what your expenditures are going to be, and we'll figure out which of those we can actually pay for, and that's how we'll set the budget. So they did away with that more recent way of budgeting that was established in 2006. Standing Constitution Committee. remember the Standing Constitution Committee came with a proposal on or an understanding of the Constitution about whether or not the president has to include the Board of Doctrine in discussions with other church bodies, or whether it's at his discretion if he should. And the Standing Constitution Committee was of the opinion that he was supposed to include the Board of Doctrine, but convention said, no, we're going the other direction. It was a pretty close vote. I don't know if it was so close that I would say 51-49, but it was, maybe 55 to 45. But, conventions like the Supreme Court, and convention interprets our Constitution. Convention decided, no, the president has the discretion whether or not to include the Board of Doctrine. And then, instead of trying to edit that bylaw on the floor of convention directed the Standing Constitution Committee to come with clearer language that gives the president that authority to determine who to have represent us in intersynodical discussions. All right, then the last bit here is just appointments. Mentioning some of the visitors at convention. Oh, no, these are the conference visitors. Conference visitors, everybody aware of what the conference visitor is? Every conference, we have 5 of them, I think. We got the Southeast, we have the Great Lakes, we have the West Central, we have the Minnesota,
5 on there.
and we have the Pacific Coast. So each conference elects what's called a visitor. And that doesn't necessarily mean he goes around visiting, though in some conferences.
Pastor's pastor.
Right. In a sense, he's the pastor's pastor. Usually it is a pastor that is, in fact, I can't think of any example where it wasn't a pastor, but it doesn't have to be. The Constitution doesn't require it.
Not being one.
I don't remember there ever being a visitor that wasn't a pastor. But one of the roles of the visitor is to be kind of like what the pastor does for his members, and that is give counsel and godly advice. That's one of his roles. There's another role. Sometimes, if there's like a dispute between a pastor and his congregation, the visitor will come in and kind of be an intermediary there to help resolve the dispute. And then there are even more severe circumstances where a congregation itself may just be going off the deep end with their pastor, and the conference visitor is supposed to step in that case too. But predominantly, yeah, the visitor is the pastor's pastor.
I think it has to be a pastor.
You think it has to be?
Yeah, it came up when Pastor Fossum retired.
Oh, you're
He was
right.
a conference visitor.
You're right.
And they made him
And he
step
no
down
longer-
from that position.
you're right.
because
You
he
were
was
right.
no longer an active pastor.
Yep. You're right. You have to be a pastor. I remember that now. Okay, so there are conference visitors. Ours is Pastor Matt Hannell. We did add some voting members of the CLC. Just so you're aware, every male called worker, whether he be a teacher or a pastor or a professor, is a voting member of the CLC automatically. And then the other voters are whatever lay delegates are appointed by the congregations. They become temporary voting members, and they're seated at each convention. But the permanent voting members, here you see Pastor Zach Sippert. He graduated from SIM this year, but he does have a call and he is accepted. In fact, he's getting installed today. They're in Bowell. Pastor Luke Willits, he's the one that took the call to that mission effort in the southwest portion of the Twin Cities. I forget the name of the suburb.
Eden Prairie.
Eden Prairie, thank you. Teacher Ben Hannell, he didn't graduate at ILC, but Mankato called him directly from their congregation. Kevin Schrader, I think that's the same in that case too. They were also accepted as voting members. There you see the elections, what transpired. Mike Eichstadt was elected again as president. Mike Wilkie again as vice president. Moderator is again Paul Nolting. Secretary is again Wayne Eichstadt. All four of those have been serving. Well, Mike Wilkie was elected at the last convention to be vice president when Mark Bernthal resigned that position. But other than that, the other ones have been serving those positions for a while. Jeff Schurenbeck on the Board of Trustees, along with layman Tom Lentz. Board of Regents, that's the board that supervises ILC. You have John Hine, James Burkhart. They've both been on the Board of Regents for a while. Board of Missions, Pastor Mayhew and Joel Kraft, they've been on Board of Missions for a while. And then Board of Education and Publication, again, no change there, Dave Nauman and Ross Rail. Appointments, Paul Nauman is still the editor of Lutheran Spokesman, Wayne Eichstadt still of the Journal of Theology, Nathan Pfeiffer still of Ministry by Mail, David Pfeiffer still of our daily devotional, Daily Rest, and Glenn Oster as CLC Webmaster. The Board of Doctrine is also appointed at every convention by the president. That no members of the Board of Doctrine changed. All the same ones there too. Next convention is scheduled for June 20th through 23rd in 2024. There was some discussion about should we go back to the way we did it before, Monday through Friday or Monday through Thursday. I had long been of the opinion that that would be the right thing to do so that the pastors could be back in their pulpits if able for Sunday. But there were quite a few laymen that stood up and said, if you do that, I can't make it.
It's overwhelming to keep it this way.
It was.
I don't like it, but I'm just one.
Right, same here. So there was an increase in attendance among the laymen going to this method. I don't know that it's a great significant increase, but whatever can make it possible for more laymen to be there, I guess that's what we should do.
Half the congregations that don't have delegates.
Right, yep, that's true. Still half of the congregations don't send delegates. Yep. And that's unfortunate. By design, convention is supposed to have the called workers are supposed to be outnumbered. And usually I think we're about 50-50.
Pretty close.
Yeah. But it's supposed to be, the called workers are supposed to be outnumbered. And for good reason, by the way. So you young men, take that into account. You don't want your pastors running your church body. I'm not saying you shouldn't trust your pastor, but just know that historically, when church bodies go awry, it's because pastors think too highly of themselves might be the way to go, the way to stay. All right, any questions or comments about convention?
I think I asked you, the 8% increase,
Mm-hmm.
who all that affected, and you weren't really sure.
It affects every synodically called worker, and it also affects every subsidized congregation. Mission Board requires the subsidized congregations to pay CLC code. So,
I know it affects us.
Right.
I wasn't sure who all.
so it affects the 4 mission subsidized congregations, and then it affects all the professors. You're wondering, does it also affect like staff at ILC? And the answer to that is yes, they all get the same, increase. Now, if they're just part-time staff, there's a difference, they have a different pay scale, so they aren't affected the same way.
They have to have a different pay scale, they're not provided housing and that sort of thing.
Right, right. But, you know, I know that, like, the workers in the office are on CLC code salary, if they're full-time. Like, that's Barb and Jess, they're full-time, and Jim Sandine, they are full-time. Now, there's some part-time workers that work behind the desk, they aren't CLC code. I think they get an hourly wage. But like the dorm parents, they're CLC code. The groundskeepers are CLC code. But they don't, you're right, those workers, well, the dorm parents, of course, have housing.
No, part of the year,
No, the whole year.
they live there all the time.
They are able to live there all the time, they don't have to. Actually, in all honesty, it's probably even a, when you think about the code salary for the dorm parents, they have all their meals provided too. So it's actually, they actually have even a higher compensation package. The only time they don't have their meals provided is during the summer.
Yeah.
So now, but any CLC congregation that is not a subsidized congregation, not a mission congregation, they're free to set their salaries at whatever level they want. There have been some that have set their salaries for their called workers substantially higher than CLC code, but predominantly, if there's a difference, it's usually the other direction.
And there's some pretty small congregations
Right.
that they just can't do it.
Right.
Cause most of them don't have mortgages and that sort of thing either, so.
Right.
And some of the old ones, everything's been paid off as far as the parsonage and, you know, the church itself. Most of them have been paid off for years.
Right. So, any other questions? All right, well then next week we'll get back into our study of John. It's been a while since we've been there, but I think we're in like chapter 19. All right, we'll stop right there.